talk about my favorite albums. I feel like you can always get some pretty good insight to a person and their musical taste based on the albums that mean the most to them, and so I compiled a patent-pending clusterfuck of a list that encompasses just about every genre you could imagine. I didn't want to just limit this to metal and rock albums, so this is literally just my favorite albums across all of music. Now, with that being said, I have heard a lot of albums throughout my life, and as a result of that, I probably forgot some. And at the end of the day, this is just personal preference and albums that mean the most to us, because I want to hear your guys' lists. No judgment, no gatekeeping, no bullshit. You can let me know down in the comment section below the albums that mean the most to you. My list is for all sorts of reasons, whether it be a time in my life I heard it that I needed to, something about just it hitting me at a time when I needed it to, or alternatively, I love the music on it, I just think the material is very good. It maybe redefined how I saw a specific genre at the time. Maybe it was something brand new that I had never heard before and it opened me up to a ton of other albums. Whatever the reasons may be, these are some of my favorite albums. Starting with Typo Negative's October Rust. This was the first Typo record I ever heard, and it set me down the rabbit hole of a lot of doom metal and gothic music. This thing is so atmospheric, and if I'm wanting a record that is just very full body and consumes the listener, I am always going to go back to this. I think there's something about the sensuality of Peter Steele's vocals and the whole way that this album is constructed. It has always been my favorite Typo record, and it got me into the rest of their discography, which I'm very thankful for. Moving on from there, The Downward Spiral by 9 Inch Nails took me by storm the first time I heard it. This was very early on in my music listening journey. I actually found this at like a flea market or a Goodwill, I don't even remember, and I picked it up because I recognized the name of the band, but I had no sort of point of reference when it came to 9 Inch Nails. I knew absolutely nothing about them. I only knew that they wrote the song that, you know, Johnny Cash sang, and this record very much lives up to its name. 9 Inch Nails is always known for being broody and moody and very emotionally poignant, but this record is on another level. It really does feel like a trudge. It really takes you down a dark place that Trent Reznor was going through at the time, and I heard this at a time when I feel like it impacted me very deeply, and it's one of those albums that have only gotten more and more meaningful throughout the years for a lot of people, myself included. Two records that I've talked about a lot on this channel throughout its timeline is Killswitch Engage's As Daylight Dies and As I Lay Dying's record Shadows Are Security. These are two of the records that got me into heavier forms of metal. I heard them when I was very early on into listening to rock and metal music. I found both of these CDs at a flea market in Ohio, and from that point forward, they became two of my favorite bands at the time. I still really enjoy them, contrary to my most recent Killswitch Engage video. While that might suggest I hate them, I very much don't, and both of these albums were tremendously important to me. They are so melodic, they're the perfect blend of heavy and aggressive, but also very thoughtful and very emotionally provoking. Oh, they are just great. Next up, Tracy Chapman's record, New Beginning. I've said before, Tracy Chapman, one of my favorite artists of all time. She's just this folksy sort of musician that always makes these beautiful songs. You probably know her because of Fast Car, which is by far her most popular song, and I could have picked a whole host of different Tracy Chapman records, but this one is amazingly well written, and it shows that scant, minimalistic instrumentation can sometimes be the most powerful thing. Just the words of someone and a guitar or a piano, all of the instrumentals, while they are minimalistic, still come out the other side feeling very lavish, and I could just melt in Tracy Chapman's voice. I absolutely adore her. I knew I wanted to put a Pink Floyd record somewhere here. It was just a matter of which one, because there are a whole host of Pink Floyd records that mean a lot to me. Atom Heart Mother, Animals, Dark Side of the Moon, obviously, or alternatively, The Wall, but I ended up going with Wish You Were Here. This is the album that, to me, has lasted the longest and that I will consistently go back to. Hearing the opening chords of Wish You Were Here, or just hearing the cinematic, theatrical nature of a song like Welcome to the Machine, this record is just great. It is not necessarily slept on by any means, but I never really hear it in like the top 3 or 4, and I even made an entire video dedicated to it a long time ago, saying why I thought it was the best Pink Floyd record, so if that's something you're interested in, maybe check that out. And I think also just knowing the background of this record and where it is coming from makes it so much more powerful. The lore behind this record is very sad, but it's also hopeful and harmonious, and I just think it's great from start start to finish. Both musically, lyrically, vocally, and just the story behind it, it's a perfect album in my opinion, a 10 out of 10. Next up, Holding Absence's self-titled album. Lucas is one of my favorite vocalists in all of post-hardcore and metalcore, and this album has a lot of post-rock and shoegazy influences coming together to create a very ambient and melodic metalcore and post-hardcore style, mostly post-hardcore. Think kind of Invent Animate if they were more post-hardcore is how I will describe it. And these songs are so amazing. Lyrically, this is a big standout for me. This is one of those albums that just hit me at a time I needed to hear it, and I heavily suggest it if you've slept on it or this band. Love Holding Absence, they are phenomenal. My favorite ambient album of all time is How to Disappear Completely's record, Seraphim. And the reason this record means a lot to me is because it helped me with my insomnia. I listen to a lot of ambient music. I have an entire playlist that is dedicated to ambient music. I listen to it when I'm writing, when I'm working, when I'm trying to sleep. It has always been something that has helped calm down my more intense emotions and always meant a lot to me in regards to that. But this record was always very special and important to me. I feel like a lot of ambient music services what it's supposed to do. It feels like sort of wallpaper in a way. But when I listen to this record, I just melt away from start to finish. It is an amazingly well-written ambient record, and I think How to Disappear Completely in general is a project very much worth checking out for ambient listeners, although you probably already have. But yeah, I just listen to this a lot to calm myself down or to help myself sleep. So much so that numerous songs on this album ended up making like my top 10 most listened to songs of the year that I was really into this record, and the #1 spot on my list went to, I believe, Seraph 2. Similarly, an album that I actually slept to is the Contortionist album Language, but I also just comfort listened to this record. Oh my god, the Contortionist is phenomenal. I could have also put Clairvoyant here because that is another album that helped me sleep and calm down a lot, but this is like a progressive metalcore. They were originally like a deathcore band, phenomenal atmosphere, beautiful production, awesome vocals, great lyricism, the perfect blend of all the progressive genres that you could want in the modern sphere. It feels very modern. And I remember the first time I heard Language, I raced to try to find a place to buy these albums from this band, and I ended up getting a couple of signed CDs off of eBay from a seller. I actually have Language signed, and it also came with Exoplanet and Clairvoyant. Please just check out The Contortionist, do yourself a favor. I don't think this album needs any introduction. Fuck you, I'm putting Metallica's The Black Album. This album revolutionized metal and rock music, and it certainly did for me too when I heard it. While it isn't my favorite Metallica album, that would be Ride the Lightning, I think that this album was very important for a lot of people, getting them into metal, getting them into rock, and this album is the perfect blend of examining the human condition, but also having the bangers, the heavier songs, and from start to finish, this album is just full of iconic, timeless songs. I don't care how many people say that Metallica sold out, there's a reason this is the best-selling heavy metal album of all time, and I was included in that when I bought it from Best Buy. Next up, I want to shout out Zombie Shark's record, I Will Destroy You, Myself, and Everything I've Ever Loved. This album changed how I saw some genres. This is a cybergrind record, and I am like the biggest advocate, the #1 fan of Zombie Shark. I've interviewed the dude, I've covered his material, and my lord, is this a manic, erratic record that blends 50 billion genres into one amalgamation that somehow still sounds coherent and well put together. It is insanely impressive to me, and even though it is very short, it just ruined music that year for me. It was one of those albums that once I heard it, I was like, what is gonna be better than this? What is going to blend things better than this? And experimentation doesn't always mean something's gonna be good, but when it comes together to create this bombastic, intense experience, my jaw was on the floor. I started going to like everyone I knew, and I was like, please check out Zombie Shark. Next up, I want to shout out Dear Agony by Breaking Benjamin. I'm a big Breaking Benjamin fan. They are one of the bands that got me into metal and rock. I said this in my Q&A video. I've always loved Breaking Benjamin. I don't care if they write the same music. I know they're not the most original, but I love them. And I could have included a lot of different albums, and I feel like Dark Before Dawn is probably the album that I should go with, but I feel like because I heard Dear Agony first and the imprint it left on me and how that sort of led me into the rest of music listening, the impact that it had and the influence it had on my music listening and how I enjoyed alt metal and alt rock and post grunge, it was incredibly important. So even though I've listened to Dark Before Dawn more and that's my favorite record from them in terms of lyrics and instrumentation and songs. Dear Agony has a lot of fantastic songs to it, and it was the album that not only got me into Breaking Benjamin, but set me on a trip to find a lot of other bands that would later get me into other forms of rock and metal. Considering everything that's been happening with Kanye West, it sucks to say this, but Kids See Ghosts' self-titled album is one of my favorite albums of all time. I bought this bitch right after I heard it. It is incredible. And this is one of those things where you kind of gotta separate the art from the artist. This is Kid Cudi and Kanye West's duo album, and this album is downright powerful. All of the themes, all of the lyrics, or at least most of the lyrics, are incredibly serious and philosophical. Kanye was on a roll this year, because if I remember right, this is when he produced Daytona by Pusha T, and he also released Ye, his own record. He was on a roll with these like short albums, these bursts of energy, and I understand Kanye West is ludicrous and ridiculous and a disgusting human being, abhorrent right now. But that doesn't change the hours of enjoyment I've gotten out of this record, how much it meant to me at the time. I remember the exact time in my life I heard this. I remember how important this album was to me. It was one of my favorites the year it released, and everyone loved this album. So regardless of how you feel about Kanye, this album's great. I have two records that are similar to Wish You Were Here in terms of the story is what means a lot to me. Architect's record Holy Hell and Bell Witch's album Mirror Reaper. They could not be more diametrically opposed, because one is like a genty metalcore album and the other is a funeral doom metal album, but both of these albums were fueled by loss, and I tend to be a very emotionally intense, empathetic person, and so when there is a deep story or concept behind an album, it tends to mean a lot to me. I also could include like the Ghosts Inside self-titled album, because coming back from the brink of their accident, incredible story. I want to do an entire video on Ghost Inside. But Architects and Bell Witch created two beautiful albums that were sadly inspired by tragedy, and Holy Hell really does feel like that. It is one of the most intense Architects albums, and that's saying something because their early albums, very heavy, very brutal, but the choruses just go insanely hard. The lyrics on this, the way it bargains with religion and life and death, and the way it deals with all of those things, fantastic. And on the opposite side of that spectrum, you have Bell Witch's Mirror Reaper, which plays out like a dirge. This album goes by so quickly, and that is in its benefit for how long it is. It feels like it goes by in a blur because it just swallows you up in the ocean. And speaking of swallowing into the ocean, just a quick shout out for probably my second favorite or favorite funeral doom metal album, Drown's record Subaqueous. If you haven't heard this, give it a try. I promise it is one of the best funeral doom metal albums you'll hear. And while we're on a roll of albums that feel like a full body experience, Primitive Man's record Caustic. I've said before, this album blew me away when I heard it. It crushes you. It is asphyxiating. It ain't inspired by no death and no tragedy. It just wants to grind you up into dust, and it succeeds in that. This album is monstrous. But let's shout out a couple deathcore albums. First up, I'm going to talk about, oh my lord, Slice the Cakes, Odyssey to the West. One of the best extreme metal albums I've ever heard. It is equal parts spoken word, technical, avant-garde if you want to call it that, deathcore, symphonic. It is an incredible concept album. It is a sprawling tapestry, and so rare to hear in this type of music. I'm a sucker for storytelling. I got turned on to this by Cover Killer Nation, so you know it's gonna be good. But speaking of deathcore, my favorite deathcore album, Eclipse by Veil of Maya. Oh my god, I went through a phase where I listened to this album religiously. This is all I spun. I would just pop that CD in and listen to it like non-stop. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of modern Veil of Maya, that's fine. It doesn't take away from the fact that this is the perfect length, the perfect instrumentation. It is the nicest blend of genty deathcore music. It's not pure blood deathcore. It's not your despised Icon. It's not your Winds of Plague. It's not even your Lorna Shore Infant Annihilator. It is Veil of Maya, and it is progressive as hell, and you gotta like that technicality and gent, which I do. And to sort of wrap up the deathcore side of things, Tomorrow We Die Live by Born of Osiris really changed changed how I saw a lot of metalcore music. I heard it around the same time I heard Eclipse, and believe me, I understand that The Discovery is like the best Born of Osiris album, but with that being said, Tomorrow We Die Alive I heard because I was getting into Sumerian Records around the time, and that's how I discovered a ton of those metalcore bands, and I had never heard anything like Machine. Up until that point, I only thought that bands like Killswitch Engage and As I Lay Dying and Shadows Fall and Unearth, those were like metalcore bands. That's what metalcore was, and even the scene metalcore bands weren't anything like it. So here comes this hyper well-produced, technical, progressively intrinsic metalcore band. It blew me away, and that sent me down the rabbit hole of one of my favorite genres, progressive metalcore / Shen. This is another album that doesn't need any introduction, Meteora by Linkin Park. I could have chose Hybrid Theory because it was the first Linkin Park album I ever heard, but Meteora had these songs that I remember most from my childhood. Around the time I was getting into like YouTube lyric videos and post-grunge stuff and AMVs and machinimas and Breaking Benjamin, Trap, Saliva, Stain, POD, all of these bands, I got into Linkin Park, and that dominated my early music listening, specifically Hybrid Theory and Meteora, but mostly Meteora. I can go back and listen to so many songs across this album and immediately snap back to that time, but also enjoy them now. I understand they're very angsty, they're that new metal rap rock stuff, but there's a reason Linkin Park is beloved and became the voice of an entire generation of people pretty much. Linkin Park in many ways was to millennials and Gen Z what Nirvana was to Gen X. Next up, Jane Remover's album Frailty. Damn, what do I even say about this album? Like, this was an album that was made before she changed her alias and changed a lot of her stylings. It was very digitalized, it was pretty lo-fi, but Kodak Moment is like a top 10 or 15 song of all time for me. This album just has everything I want from a production department, from a vocal and lyric department. I love electronic music, I love hyperpop music, I love this digitalized pop sort of music, and this whole thing is very atmospheric and ambient. The way that she employs sampling and weird effects to pitch her voice or to just pitch the instrumentals or adding in all these samples, it just makes these really cohesive listening experiences. I mean, Kodak Moment literally plays out like an entire album in the span of like, what, 6 minutes? And side note, I think that Census Designated and pretty much everything that she's been doing recently is also very good. Next up, See You Space Cowboys, The Romance of Affliction. This is my favorite See You Space Cowboy album. It is the one that got me into them, although I had heard of them prior. I hadn't really gotten fully into them until this. Really sad about the recent stuff that's happened, but this album spoke to me in every single way. The imagery, the lyricism, the vocals, the entire concept of this album, the way that Connie literally was coming off of a fucking suicide attempt, she said, and wrote this album from that place. It is emotionally in-depth, it has so much dimension to it, the whole thing is so interesting, it's a complex blend of styles. It may not be their most experimental record, because you could say that could go to like Songs for the Firing Squad, the compilation, or Coup de Grace, their most recent and potentially last album, but I think Romance of Affliction is the one that means the most to me on a personal level, because I really needed to see and hear a band like them at the time. Next up, Depeche Mode's record Violator. God, I love this Depeche Mode album. I don't even know what it is about this album. It is just so catchy and fresh and fun. It's that new wavy electronic sort of music. I like a lot of albums from that time period. You could put a New Order album here. You could even put something like Aphex Twin. But this album doesn't necessarily have like a super emotional reason behind it. I just heard it when I was very young, thought it was very catchy, owned it on physical copy, listened to it a ton, and go back to it a lot. Like, I don't care where I'm at or what mood I'm in, if I'm hearing like, let me show you the world in my eyes, it just gets in my head, it gets stuck in my head so much, I absolutely love it. Backwash's album, I Lie Here Buried with My Rings and My Dresses, oh lord, this thing fucked me up when I first heard it. The rage that is embodied in this album, and how she talks about every single topic that she talks about here, and how ferocious and tenacious she feels, like this feral beast that's been let out of a cage and is so angry at the things that has happened to her, the things she's observing touching in the world. It is incredible. Not to mention the features going hard, the production being so crushing. This thing is so distorted and loud. It is horrorcore mixed with industrial music, mixed with metal, and it mixed with like a little bit of witch house sometimes. You feel the aggression in her voice, and you feel the aggression of the message and narrative she's talking about, and whether you agree with it or not, it will hit you in some form or fashion, and I think that polarization is something that draws me to it, but this album is amazing. Era's album Drift is my favorite Era album. Era is my favorite band. I've said that many times, and it sucks because I could go with a lot of different albums. Impulse is good, Augment is phenomenal. I even think Moments of Clarity is really good. I have great memories with all of them, but I heard Drift and got Drift right around release, and I have just so many vivid memories of it being summertime and just seeing the sun go down and chilling on walks or being like a car or something and just having it play in my headphones. It really impacted me. While I do enjoy the philosophy of Augment and Impulse and stuff, Drift being more about this sort of experience of life and disassociation connected with me a lot more, and that's something I related to and resonated with. It was also the first Era album I heard and led me down the point of enjoying all of their material, so I think that helps a lot. Next up, Sophie's album Oil of Every Pearl's on Insides. It has my favorite song of all time. It's Okay to Cry by Sophie is my favorite song. And funnily enough, within the title, it actually does make me tear up. It's one of the only songs that makes me incredibly sad every time I hear it. And maybe that is because she's gone. Maybe that's because of the circumstances she's gone. Or maybe that's just because when I heard it, I was processing a lot of things that the album itself talks about and the song itself talks about. And when I heard Sophie, it not only changed how I viewed pop music and electronic music with like the A.G. Cooks of the world and the Charlie XCXs and just that whole sort of vibe, and led me down the rabbit hole of later discovering artists like Dorian Electra and Arca. Sophie connected with me in like a chokehold. But I saved my favorite album for last. Nothing Nowhere's album, Ruiner. I love Nothing Nowhere. I'm actually seeing Nothing Nowhere this year. For the first time ever, I'm actually going to see him, so if you go to the Ohio show of Nothing Nowhere in like May, you might see me there. I know this album isn't the most original. I know this album isn't the most forward-thinking, but it is the perfect blend of emo and hip-hop and indie that all comes together, and even though there are Nothing Nowhere albums that are maybe better, these songs from front to back are instantly quotable, instantly recognizable. I heard this at one of the worst times in my life, I would say. I had recently lost my best friend. I was pretty much all alone. I was isolating for like a straight year by myself. It's around the time I started this YouTube channel actually, and started doing like voice acting and stuff to distract myself. And so I just have many hours listening to Ruiner just by myself. I didn't really have anyone in my life to share it with, and I've kept Nothing Nowhere sort of this best kept secret where I don't really talk that much about him, but when I do, it is massive high praises because he is my favorite solo artist. And this album isn't going to be for everyone. This is very much one of those things where I heard it when I needed to, but I also just think it's a very high quality album. So I definitely highly suggest checking it out. But I am tired, my voice is tired, and I think it's time to wrap this up. You can let me know down in the comment section below your favorite albums and your thoughts of mine. Have you heard any of mine? Let me know down in the comment section below. I can't wait to hear it. Agree or disagree with my opinions? There is no wrong answer. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is. My name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.